Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 340. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the Fall of Númenor by exploring the chapter Aldarion Erendis. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Caitlin of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, and KG. And a shout out to our newest patrons, Richard W. and Carolyn S. Thank you all so much for joining our fellowship. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in July of 2023, Seb M., Matthew W., Wordy, David of Pints with Jack, and Chris L. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lends you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. And if you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right. Well, over the next 3 episodes, we'll return to the story of Aldarion, whom we met 2 episodes ago. Aldarion is the son of Tar-Meneldur and the expectant heir to Númenor's throne. But as we will learn, he is a man torn between a deep longing for the sea and his destiny as Númenor's king. The original source for this chapter is Unfinished Tales, The Mariner's Wife. We have in fact covered this story before on the Tolkien Road in great detail, back in episodes 183, 185, 186, and 187. For a more detailed discussion of the story itself, I'll refer you to those episodes. Check the show notes for more info. However, in this episode, I'd like to touch on some of the prevailing themes in this story that relate to the larger story of Númenor, and unpack some key passages from this chapter. So we might think of this story as the young man and the sea. That's the central conflict of it all. And to set the stage, let's consider the opening paragraph. The sea longing came anew upon Aldarion, son of Tar-Meneldur, 5th king of Númenor. And he departed again and yet again from Númenor, and his mind turned now to ventures that might not be compassed with one vessel's company. Therefore he formed the guild of venturers that afterwards was renowned. To that brotherhood were joined all the hardiest and most eager mariners, and young men sought admission to it even from the inland regions of Númenor, and Aldarion they called the great captain. At that time he, having no mind to live upon land in Armenelos, had a ship built that should serve as his dwelling place. He named it therefore Eambar, which means sea-dwelling, and at times he would sail in it from haven to haven of Númenor. But for the most part it lay at anchor off Tol Uinen, and that was a little isle in the bay of Romena that was set there by Uinen, the Lady of the Seas. Upon Eambar was the guild house of the venturers, and there were kept the records of their great voyages. For Tar-Meneldur looked coldly on the enterprises of his son, and cared not to hear the tale of his journeys, believing that he sowed the seeds of restlessness and the desire of other lands to hold. So why did Tar-Meneldur look coldly on his son's interest in the sea? Well, he believed that it sowed the seeds of restlessness and the desire of other lands to hold. And I think that's really an important passage there to highlight. You know, as I've learned more about Númenor, as I've studied the topic of Númenor and how it really fits into the overall scheme of Middle-earth's history, it's really dawned on me, there's this tension with Númenor, because it's this island paradise that's given to this people as a reward, to these mortals as a reward for their service in overthrowing Morgoth in the First Age. However, it's clear that men, no matter how long they live, are not really made for this world, not in a final sense. They're not meant to find their complete and utter enjoyment in this world. And so you have this tension that grows because they have this island paradise, really the closest thing to a paradise that mortals are able to achieve in this world. But they have a desire, some of them at least, have a desire also to explore other places, to go back to other places. They can't simply be content with this paradise that they have right here. And I don't know that we're necessarily meant to say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, like in a final sense, that we're meant to make some kind of moral judgment upon that draw away from Númenor. But Tar-Meneldur takes it a step further, and I think this is really illuminating because he says it sowed the seeds of restlessness and the desire of other lands to hold. That second part is the really scary part, right? The desire of other lands to hold these things. And when we see a term like hold, right, put in this context within the story of Middle Earth, it really should allude to things like the desire for the Silmarils, the desire for the One Ring, right? It's a desire to possess more than what has been given to you. In a way, it's almost like the original sin of Middle Earth. So when we see those terms, we understand Meneldore's fear here. He believes that his son, in being drawn to the sea and drawn to exploring other lands that are far away, is going to begin to desire to hold those other lands, and so introduce that original sin, right, of the rest of Middle Earth back into this island paradise that they've had now for several hundred years. Ultimately, the result is estrangement between father and son. The next big topic that I'd like to make sure we pay attention to is the role that Uinen, the Lady of the Sea, plays with regard to Númenor and with regard to the overall story of Númenor and this story. So from Valaquenta, we learn that Uinen is the spouse of the Maya Ossë. So she is a Maya herself, right? So she's a goddess, right? She's not quite on the level of the Valar in terms of their divinity, but she's one of the lesser gods, one of the greater lesser gods, if you will, right? So she is a goddess, and so from Valaquenta it says, "To her mariners cry, for she can lay calm upon the waves, restraining the wildness of Ossë. The Númenorians lived long in her protection and held her in reverence equal to the Valar. She rescued her husband Ossë from the service of Melkor and helped to restore him to the service of Ulmo." So it's really important to understand that Uinen is very dear to the people of Númenor. They really hold her, in a reverence that's equal to the Valar, right? So even though she is, in the grand scheme of things, on a lesser level, perhaps than the Valar in an objective sense, for the Númenorians, she is on the same level as the Valar, and we will see throughout this story that they really have a special devotion to her. But it's also important because she played this role in bringing her husband Ossë back from the service of Melkor. He was seduced, he was tempted, like a lot of the other Maiar, to serve Melkor, but he was drawn back by his wife, by Uinen, and so she is the lady of the seas that really calms the seas, as over against her husband Ossë, who we kind of learn also from Valaquenta has this tendency to just kind of delight in the violence of the seas. Not with really any malice towards anyone, it would seem, but just because he can, right? It's kind of like it's kind of like someone if you played a sport or you're into kind of an aggressive form of music, it's like a metalhead, it's just like wants to bang his head. It's not about like getting mean towards somebody else. It's just has a lot of energy and wants to take out that aggression in kind of a violent way, right? Or you're playing a sport with somebody and they just want to go into it full speed, right? That's would seem to be the heart of Ossë. And so he was drawn towards Melkor, and we don't know much about that story, but we know that he was drawn towards him, and Uinen had to rescue him before he went too far down that path. So, Uinen is really a pretty fascinating figure that plays into the history of Númenor in really a background way, but in a very important way, and she'll come up again in the story of Aldarion and Erendis. Over the course of his long youth, Aldarion undertakes many voyages to Middle-earth, all of them lasting several years. Tar-Meneldur and Almarion the Queen increasingly urge Aldarion to cease from his long voyages in order to prepare for his future as ruler of Númenor, but to no avail. And if you go to like a website like Tolkien Gateway and search for Aldarion, you can actually see a list of all the different voyages. It's easy to lose track within this chapter because he just seems to be constantly. He comes back for a little while and then he goes away to sea for like years at a time. I think the longest voyage that's recorded with him here is something like 14 years. I mean, goodness, think about being away from your home for 14 years. And, back before, really modern seafaring technology of the last really 100 years, people could be away on voyages for, 5 years. I think in Moby Dick, they depart on a voyage of 5 years. back in when we're still in the age of sail and they're not yet using steam power. They could be gone for a long time. Even in a story, one of my favorite short stories by Joseph Conrad, Youth, they're gone for a long period of time on a steamer, actually. So it's still possible. And I know from my own time in serving in the Navy, we would go out for months at a time. And sometimes, sometimes ships could be gone for even longer than that, right? Now, they might not be at sea that entire time, but they're going to be gone from their home port for a long time. Of course, wherever we are nowadays, we think, oh, well, I can just fly home if I really need to. And that would often happen. That will often happen with people in modern navies, right? They might be gone. Their ship might be gone on deployment for a long time, maybe longer than a year, but they might, fly back home while the rest of the ship is out there for a short period of time, just to go on leave for a little while and visit their family. But, in this case, Aldarion could be gone for years at a time. But he wasn't necessarily always at sea. A lot of times he was working in the, close to the shoreline of Middle Earth, and he was learning about the different peoples back in Middle Earth. But around the year 800 of the Second Age, he is first introduced to Erendis, a lady of the house of Beor. He hints at his interest in her, but nevertheless departs for another long voyage. The conflict between Aldarion's love of the sea and his parents' wish for him to settle into his future obligations is further intensified by the budding relationship between Aldarion and Erendis. So even though he leaves after first being introduced to her, he leaves pretty quickly thereafter. When he comes back, their relationship continues to develop. At one point, in response to his father, Aldarion says, "To what purpose then is the gracing of our ships if they are to sail to no shores and may seek nothing not seen before?" Right? So over against Meneldor's concern of, Aldarion is going to want to hold other lands, that he's going to want to possess other things, and thus introduce this original sin back into the culture of Númenor. Aldarion says, like, why do we even, have this land? Why do we even have these ships if they're not to sail? If, like, are we just supposed to be confined here like it's a prison on Earth? Even if it is a really nice prison, right? Even if it's a white collar prison, right? Like, it still feels imprisoning if we can't go anywhere else and seek other places. We know we can't go to the West because that's the Undying Lands and we're not allowed there because of the ban. But why can't we go back to the East? Why can't we seek things that we haven't seen before? So it's not entirely a what I would call like a benevolent motivation, but it's not necessarily an evil one. It's wanderlust, right? It's this idea of wanderlust, that Aldarion is still a young man in the Númenorian scheme of things, and he has this desire to go and see these other places. And I would say this is a desire that has the potential to be a very benevolent one. It has a potential to go back to these other lands, to meet these other peoples, and to introduce them to the ways of Númenor, when really they're still operating in many cases under the teachings, under the machinations of Morgoth, right? The Dark Lord who was defeated in the First Age. It's hard to unlearn those evil habits, those habits of domination that they likely learned from Morgoth. But there's potential under the sway, under the influence of Númenor to unlearn those things. And indeed, early in the history of Númenor, we really get that sense that, they weren't going back there to dominate, to colonize other peoples. They were going back there to teach them, to help bring them up, to lift them up, to teach them the true ways of goodness as opposed to the ways taught them by Morgoth. In Aldarion, we find the question of Númenor's destiny personified. Are the Númenorians to remain confined forever to their island, or do they have some role to play in the lands their forefathers left behind? On at least one voyage, Aldarion has gone for so long that he is feared lost, a troubling prospect for the stability of Númenor, since he is the only son of Tar-Meneldur, and Númenor is to this point governed by agnatic primogeniture, meaning the throne cannot pass to a female. At this point in Númenor's history, the throne has always passed to the eldest son of the present king. So it's been a pretty uncontroversial passes to the eldest son. Thus, if Aldarion were lost, it would be the first great test of Númenor's political stability. If Aldarion's lost, it can't pass to one of his sisters. He has two sisters, and it can't pass to one of them because they have this agnatic primogeniture. So it would become somewhat of a controversial point. Now, you may say, well, they can probably figure it out pretty easily at this point, but we know from history that in the grand scheme of the history of men, if you look at any questions like this, even when it's clear like it should pass to his son, it's not always just this thing that easily happens. It can be a very controversial issue at any point. But thankfully, even after they think that he may be lost because he's been gone so long, Aldarion returns. While Aldarion and Erendis are eventually betrothed, we learn that Erendis harbors within herself a fierce disdain for the sea, viewing it as her rival. At one point, she even rebukes Valandil, the maternal grandfather of Aldarion, for referring to her as Uineniel, meaning daughter of Uinen. Call me by no such name. I am no daughter of Uinen. Rather, she is my foe. Wow, right? Those are strong words to go against a goddess. This must have come off like blasphemy to the Númenóreans present. Uinen was essentially the divine patroness of the land. Thus, in her words here, we see that Aldarion and Erendis are likely destined for a tumultuous relationship. At a later time, the two descend from the holy mountain Meneltarma together, and Erendis inquires after Aldarion's love for Númenor. I love it indeed, he answered, though I think that you doubt it. For I think also of what it may be in time to come, and the hope and splendor of its people. And I believe that a gift should not lie idle and hoard. But Erendis denied his words, saying, Such gifts as come from the Valar, and through them from the One, are to be loved for themselves now, and in all nows. They are not given for barter, for more or for better. The Edain remain mortal men, Aldarion, great though they be. And we cannot dwell in the time that is to come, lest we lose our now for a phantom of our own design. Once again, Aldarion bears witness to the question of Númenor's purpose, while Erendis advocates for loving the land as it is. Despite their betrothal, Aldarion can't quit the sea, and makes further voyages. But he eventually makes good their betrothal, wedding Erendis 70 years after they first met. So next time we'll pick up with the story of the wedding of Aldarion and Erendis. But there are 3 images to consider in this chapter. The first image appears to be a pencil sketch of Erendis, and we can see perhaps a ship in the background here, but Erendis is turned away from the sea, as we can see here, right? She's turned away from the sea and turned back towards the land of Númenor, which she loves. The second image that we see is a beautiful color image of what appears to be one of Aldarion's ships in the haven of Romena. I would say this is most likely the ship that was referred to in the opening passage I read, Eambar, which means sea dwelling, and this was, of course, kind of the guild house of the Venturers, right? This group of seafarers that Aldarion really started. And then the last image we see in this chapter is a pencil sketch of a plant, and I believe that this is a pencil sketch of a bough of Oilaire. That's a hard word to say. Oilaire. Oilaire, the green bough of return, which is also referred to in this chapter, and towards the end of it in a somewhat ominous way. So, wonderful artwork, as always, from Alan Lee. I think at the end of the day, I really just skimmed the details of this chapter. There's so much to it. I mean, this is a really, really rich chapter. The whole story of Aldarion and Erendis it's one of these, it's the most detailed kind of story of this nature that we have of the Second Age. Yes, of course, we have a Calabaith, we have of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which goes a lot into the history of the Second Age. But when it comes to kind of this, into a particular point in time, a particular generation of Númenor, this is the only story we really have in detail like this that really gives us a sense of, a deep sense of personalities in play. And it's really an important turning point. It's one of these stories that I just think to myself, oh man, Tolkien, why couldn't you have written more stories like this of the Second Age? It would have been such a treasure to have. And I know at one point he thought it wasn't really worth writing the stories of the Second Age because it was a dark age. But when I read things like this, I'm like, no, you could have written lots of stories like this. So unfortunately, we'll never have Tolkien's own writings from this period, but we do have this story, which is a really magnificent story with so much more to be said about it. So I really encourage you to check out episodes 183, 185, 186, and 187. That's where Greta and I really go into a deep discussion of the Mariner's Wife, this whole story from start to finish. We probably spend, my guess is 4 hours discussing the whole thing. But as for this episode, that is a wrap. All right, everybody, keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. expect Greta to return here, shortly, probably within the next few episodes, and have some announcements to make as far as kind of what the plan is going forward. I will be continuing to do probably standalone episodes on the Fall of Númenor as I make my way through this book. But when Greta returns, I have kind of a plan that will make it a little easier for her to be involved on a more regular basis. So I'm really looking forward to telling you all more about that. All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening, and thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Caitlin of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, KG, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Robert H., Paul D., Julia, Wordy, Joe Bagelman, Richard K., Matt R., Matthew W., John W., Eugene D., Chris B., Daniel S., Seb M., Corey C., Carolyn S., Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T., Red Hawk, Shannon S., Brian O., Zeke F., James L., Chris L., Aja V., Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C., David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. All right. Thank you all so much for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.